What I have here for you is my personal procedure for sermon writing. And you probably all have your own procedures for sermon writing. It could be better than mine. But I'll just give this to you because I find it useful to see what other people do. And I figured you guys might find it interesting to see what I do. So the first thing I do is I find old sermons and notes and look at those. I make a note sheet with the readings on them, and as I read it for the first time, just scratching down some thoughts that come to mind. I read the readings in the English, in the vernacular, and then a very important step is I discuss the text with others, especially lay people, to see in what ways, what questions they have or how they understand things. If you only ever think about it on your own and you don't actually ever talk with people about it, then sometimes you miss the way that people are actually thinking about it, how they hear it. And that's actually how I find out how people misunderstand the text, is if I can talk with them about it. What do you think this means? What do you think this means? And sometimes they're like, I have no clue. I've never understood that. And so that's what really kind of guides me whenever I'm doing my exegetical work. Yeah.
How do you do that? How do you... Who are you discussing it with, and in what?
Well, mostly my wife. Yeah, mostly my wife. Yeah. But if if you're a single guy, or if your wife isn't around, or she doesn't want to listen to you talk about this, then I think it would be good to find other people and maybe use the text for the coming Sunday in your shut-in visits, and talk through the text with the shut-ins to see, what do you think this means? How have you understood this? That sort of thing, and just get some feedback. Yeah.
I think that is invaluable, what you've just mentioned. Not necessarily talking to your wife or my wife, because, that's a pretty small circle. Yeah. But over here we have a guy that used to live downtown, and he would spend holidays with us. And what I think are some of the better sermons that I'll have come after talking to Les for 2 hours about the Christmas texts or what have you. I think that if we can humble ourselves enough to interact with the people and how are they hearing the preaching, it's really to know your hearers in a different way than just what's going on in their lives. I'm not quite sure the forums either, but I think it'd be invaluable if we had more forums to...
Well, yeah, I agree. So finding some way, and that's generally, when you've got the text, sometimes it's very clear you have to preach on this or that thing, but sometimes there's a million things you could preach on a particular text, and you can't say it all. And so talking with the lay people actually shows maybe something that they really misunderstand. They've always misunderstood this text somehow. And then I'm going to bring that up and try to correct that misunderstanding, and that would be a big part of my sermon. I then also have exegetical documents, computer documents on my computer, and this is very similar to the project that I'm having you guys do as this part of this class, is preparing some of these exegetical documents. Essentially what it is for me is I've got different file folders. And one file folder will be, for example, Matthew, and in there I'll have a different Word document for each chapter of Matthew. And then so whatever text I'm preaching on, my notes will either be in that electronic document or in a physical file for the Sunday of the church year. And so I can go in there and then see the past research that I've done. And it saves a lot of time for the future. So within that document, there's a section of the exegetical document that's the general outline of the chapter. I get that from my Greek New Testament. The Greek New Testament I have has Latin on one side and Greek on the other, and the Latin side always has these headings for each part of the chapter. You could get them from wherever you want. You can decide your own outline of the chapter, but I find it helpful to at least see where the whole chapter is going. Then I do a comparison of the main Bible translations. What this does is it shows me where in the Greek or the Hebrew text there are some differences of understanding, historically speaking. So I always look at my favorite version is the New King James. Yours might be different, that's fine. But I look at the New King James because I like it. I compare it with the ESV because that's what the Missouri Synod uses. I look at the King James because that's the most significant English translation that there is. I look at Luther's 1545 German translation because that's the most significant German translation coming out of the Reformation that there is. I look at the Vulgate because that's the most significant translation of the Bible coming out of the early church and into the Middle Ages. And that's pretty much it. Sometimes I'll throw in something else, like there's this 17th century Latin translation of the Bible from Greek and Hebrew into Latin that's hyperliteral, and that's Sebastian Schmidt from Strasbourg. I mentioned him the other day. Sometimes I'll look at him, but not always. And by doing that, basically I've got the text of whatever. I start with the New King James, and then wherever there's a variant, I'll put in square brackets and say ESV : and give what it says instead. And so by doing that, I see exactly where the translations widely differ. And so then, after that, I'm doing the actual reading through the Greek text, and by looking then at the Greek text, or the Hebrew text, I'm able to then see why the different translations have gone the different ways they have. And sometimes the translations are wrong, and sometimes they're just difference of opinion in what the original text might mean. So this is maybe, this is the other thing, I don't necessarily do all of these steps every time. I essentially go through these steps until I've got enough material, and I always do, I always look at the original, but I kind of go through these steps until I've generated enough material that I've got enough for a sermon. Okay, so it's like these are just thought starters in a way. I have on my computer, I have an index of topics, like a topical index from not all, but from a lot of the books that I've read. And on all the different topics, I'll have put in Bible passages or references to the Book of Concord or to other books. And so sometimes I'll go and see if I've read a book that has some detailed, some good information on whatever topic has come up. So that's what I mean by check the index ray room for topics. That's essentially just looking through your library to see, is there some topic that I would really maybe want to make use of in this sermon. I look up the passage in the Bible reference for the Book of Concord so that I see how the Lutheran confessions have understood and interpreted this passage. Not that that would limit our exegesis, but we should at least be aware of it. Then I'll read a commentary or look up the passage in dogmatics. I think that Pieper's Dogmatics and Chemnitz's Lotzi are some of the best Bible commentaries that we have. And so I'll go ahead and do that. Then I'm always thinking about what would be the practical uses of this pericope in terms of doctrine, warning, admonishing, or consoling. And with that, I'm also, let's see, I don't know if I've got this on there. I'll get to that later on. But I also am asking the question of why should the hearers care? Why is this important for the hearers to hear? And if I can't answer that to myself, then what I'm teaching is just trivia, and maybe I can leave that out. So I always ask myself that question. So I try to look for the practical uses. I like to bring them down to 4 instead of 5, and those are the ones that are there. Sometimes I'm looking at this Ernestinian Bible to find it. Sometimes I can look at Gerhard's Schola Pietatis, but most of the time I'm actually just thinking on my own, just looking at the text and seeing what is this, how can this be used, or how can this be applied. Often, not all the time, but often I will look for an antithesis to see how is this passage misunderstood. And I like to find real ways that I think that it's misunderstood, and I don't have a good source for looking at how like a charismatic or a Baptist would misunderstand a text. And I don't want to surf the internet looking for stuff. That takes too long. So I've got a good way to find how Roman Catholics understand a passage. I have a Vulgate Bible, and this Vulgate Bible I have was printed in Madrid, mid-20th century, and in the footnotes it gives cross-references to Denzinger's book, and this book by Denzinger, I think I've listed it there, the Enchiridion Symbolorum, that's actually in English also, and it's Sources of Catholic Dogma. So a lot of times we'll look at Denzinger to see how a passage has been understood or misunderstood. A lot of times we'll look at Calvin's Institutes to see how Calvin took it and see if there's something there I can preach against. So, and then I always ask myself, where is the cross in this pericope, or where is Christ in this pericope? And sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not. Sometimes I'll go ahead and bring it in from one of the other texts of the day, but I don't force it in. If the cross of atonement isn't there, then essentially what I'll do is simply remind our hearers of who the true God is, who they are, and about his will to save mankind through Christ and his death. At some point here, I haven't done all these steps, but at some point I'll go ahead and outline my sermon. Usually the way that I do outlining is I take generally 3 sentences. I generally make 3 or sometimes 4 sentences. And the sentences have to make sense in order if you only read those sentences. So that's my rule of thumb when it comes to an outline. That if I was just to look at the bold sentence that gives the outline point and I read them in order, it has to make sense. And if the outline doesn't make sense, if you just read the outline, then the sermon's not going to make sense. It's going to be disjointed. So sometimes that really requires this is sometimes for me the hardest part, is trying to figure out where's the shape of this sermon going? What's it going to do? And this is where I'll generally take a long walk. I've done all of my exegetical work. Maybe I've got some notes written on a piece of paper in my pocket, and I'm going to take a walk around the seminary campus a couple times, put in a couple miles, and meanwhile I'm just thinking. And that will generally give me the right outline. Sometimes if the points that you really, really want to make from the text, there's really no real logical order. There's just 2 or 3 unrelated things that you want to talk about, and they all come up in the text. You can still make them make sense. Sometimes what the Old Orthodox folks would do is they would just say, on this Christmas day, there are 4 bells ringing that bring in the Christmas holiday, or whatever. The first bell is Christ did this or that. The second bell is this, Christ did this, or, and so they'll kind of have just maybe arbitrary topics that they want to talk about, but they're linked in some way that will be catchy and memorable. Or you can simply go straight through the text. You just say, well, first this happened in the text, then this happened, but there's got to be some kind of a structure there so that people can kind of follow where you're going. Another thing I think is important is finding illustrations for each point. I don't always do this, but I think it's very helpful. And my basic thought on illustrations is that illustrations have to be drawn from normal everyday life. If you use an illustration of something that's not common knowledge to most people, like a piece of artwork that you saw in the Louvre, you're not really illustrating anything, you're teaching something new. So an illustration has to be based on something that is already well known to the people. So I've got these categories of illustration. I don't remember where I got them. I think I made them up on my own, but I may have stolen them from somebody else. And so if there's something that I want to illustrate, I'll just go through these categories and see, is there something in any of these categories that would illustrate the point that I'm trying to make? And usually by going through those categories, I'll find something that works. And you might be able to add to these categories. I got that idea from using these categories from, I think, Augustine and maybe ancient rhetoric, where they had these categories, and that way, extemporaneously, if they were speaking, they could if they wanted an illustration, they could think through their categories and say, okay, I've got one that I can explain this with.
Dr. Fickenscher, his ears would be ringing without seeing sports on here.
Oh, sports. Okay, well, there you go. Yeah, you could put sports on there, I suppose. I guess I don't do sports that often. I don't know. Likewise, you don't see TV shows on here. You don't find movies on here. I don't find that very helpful. Because I think when you do that, when you use those kinds of illustrations, then the attention of the hearers is going to remain on that illustration, is not going to get back to what you're talking about. That's why I think these other kinds of illustrations would be more helpful, and I wouldn't even use sports now that I think about it. I'm not saying there's anything wrong or a preacher's a bad preacher if he uses sports as an illustration, not saying that, but in my own practice I don't do it. I don't think that would be very useful. And then I answer the question, as I said, why is this important for the hearers to hear? And then I write, and those word counts are not, they're not at all, I don't always do that. In fact, most of the time I don't do it. But if you're preaching, like when I was at CPH and preaching in the chapel, I absolutely kept it at 1,000 words because I knew it would be too long if I went over. And actually for chapel sermons at the seminary, I do about 1,400 words. And then for a Sunday sermon, I'm a lot of times up around 2,000, so 1,800, 2,000 words. And then I practice. So you guys might have many, widely different ways of preparing a sermon that don't use these, and maybe you would have some interesting extra ones that you would definitely add in there to this. So don't think of this as the thing that you're supposed to do, and Dr. Mays told you you're supposed to do this. Because I'm not. I'm just giving you ideas of how I do it and works for me. And I guess the other thing about preaching that I've come to value is that it's important to have different tools in your toolbox to be able to do different things. This is kind of what I've found that works for me, but if I was preaching every week, week in and week out, I would absolutely develop some other ways of doing it. Luther, more often than not, will simply follow the course of a text. What do we call that? An expository. Yeah, expository preaching. Usually that's what he does. And there are other various approaches that have been done, and so I definitely would. I also like Walther's sermons. Walther's got a very interesting way of taking whatever he's talking about. He'll very often divide people up into 2 or 3 groups. And he'll say, there are some people who think of things this way, and then he'll kind of rip on them for a while and kind of blame them. Then there are others who think about things this way, and then there are true Christians who think about things this way. And by doing that, you're getting the different kinds of people in your congregation. They're kind of identifying with one of these ways of thinking, and then they're hearing their own ways of thinking basically destroyed. And then they're hearing a description of how things ought to be. So it's like just different tools that different preachers have. So I really like the idea of how to learn preaching by reading and analyzing the sermons, and a lot of sermons, of the best preachers of Christendom. Whoever you might consider the best preachers of Christendom. I've got my favorites. My favorites are Augustine, Martin Luther, Gerhard, and C.F.W. Walther. Those are the ones I like to read. And if you do that and are just very attentive to how they do their thing, then you'll have a number of different tools that you can put into your own toolbox and pull out from time to time. And keeping it, using different ways of preaching and keeping it fresh that way, I think is really useful. Okay.
How or where are you reading Augustine's sermon?
Well, there's a lot of his sermons in the old Nicene and post-Nicene Fathers series, which you can just read online at the Christian Classics Ethereal Library, for example. There's also a nice 19th century translation into English of selected sermons of St. Augustine that I found, and it includes a whole lot of sermons that are not in the Nicene and post-Nicene Fathers series. And so I like that. I like reading some of those sermons. You can also, there's this 4-volume set that I just donated to the library because I wasn't ever using it. And it's called The Sunday Sermons of the Great Fathers. And it gives you patristic sermons for each Sunday of the church year. And a lot of those sermons are really bad. But some of them are really good. Some of them are really good. So, and there's often a St. Augustine sermon in there. That's one of the possibilities. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the useful explanations of Scripture. This is lecture that I did at the Rocky Mountain District Pastors Conference last October. Those of you that were there for that might recognize some of this. But it will be a little different because I've got some things at the end for us to look at examples that are going to be a little different. Gerhard, when he's talking about preaching, he says the church's preacher has two duties: the interpretation of Scripture and applying it to salutary use. And the Bible passages that come up time and time again in so many different places in the 17th century for the uses of Scripture are 2 Timothy 3:16-17. I've read these passages to you already several times this week. Also Romans 15:4, but also 1 Corinthians 10:11. All of that happened to them as an example, but it was written for our warning, upon whom the end of the world has come. And on the basis of these passages, the Lutheran Orthodox came up with 4 or 5 uses or useful applications of Scripture. And we're going to get into, with Gerhard, you know that he uses 5. I like to do it with 4 because some of of Gerhard's 5, I think, is an unnecessary subdivision. Also, I guess I would say that what we'll see is that in the biblical text, when it talks about these differing uses of Scripture, it's not for certain that St. Paul meant exactly what the Lutheran Orthodox meant by, for example, admonition or consolation or whatever. The apostle might have meant something different, and it's likely that there was some overlap in the concepts, in the way that St. Paul put it. But with the Lutheran Orthodox, they really kind of try to divvy these up and make each one very distinct. So whether or not exegetically that's the right thing to do, it is very useful homiletically, and that's what we're going to get into today. Useful applications were in the 17th century.